The park buzzed with quiet activity, a slice of tranquility in the heart of Los Angeles. Children darted between trees, their laughter echoing off the concrete walking paths, while joggers passed by, their rhythmic strides blending with the distant hum of traffic. A cluster of retirees fed pigeons by a fountain, chatting in hushed tones. The golden afternoon sunlight streamed through the leafy canopy, casting intricate shadows on the ground. On a secluded bench near a row of blooming jacarandas, a man sat alone. He wasn't flashy, didn't draw attention with elaborate gestures or loud words. Dressed in a plain gray t-shirt and faded jeans, his only remarkable feature seemed to be the book he held, its thick, dog-eared pages suggesting hours of deep thought. His face, partially obscured by a red MAGA hat, remained calm and focused as he flipped through the pages. For most passers-by, he was just another park visitor, but not for Karen. From her spot near the ice cream stand, she spotted the hat almost immediately, the bright red clashing against the natural hues of the park. Her gaze narrowed as indignation bubbled within her. She wasn't sure who he was, but the message on his cap was all she needed to know. To her, it was a symbol of everything wrong in the world. She muttered to herself, clutching her phone tightly. "He shouldn't be here," she whispered, her voice trembling with manufactured outrage. "Someone has to do something." Karen, in her mid-40s, wore her authority like armor. Her sharp-heeled boots clicked against the pavement as she moved closer, her piercing stare fixed on the man. She lingered at a distance, observing him, searching for some justification to act. He didn't look dangerous. If anything, his calm demeanor seemed out of place in her mind. But the hat was enough. As she edged closer, her indignation only grew. The man paid her no mind, seemingly absorbed in his book. Karen crossed her arms, trying to find an angle that would validate her feelings. When nothing obvious presented itself, she whipped out her phone and dialed 911, her voice loud and dramatic enough to turn heads. "Yes, I'd like to report a suspicious individual at the park," she said, glancing at the man with a mix of triumph and disdain. "He's sitting on a bench, wearing a MAGA hat, and it's making people uncomfortable." A few park-goers paused, their curiosity piqued by Karen's theatrical tone. They exchanged glances, trying to figure out what warranted such a call. Oblivious to the growing attention, Karen continued, her voice rising with each word. "Yes, that's correct. A red MAGA hat. I don't know what he's planning, but it's unsettling, and I think someone should check it out." Nearby, a young couple with a toddler had overheard the call. The woman raised an eyebrow. "Is she serious?" she whispered to her partner. Others began to notice the scene unfolding, their murmurs adding a faint buzz to the park's ambiance. The man on the bench, still reading, seemed untouched by the commotion building around him. But those watching were starting to connect the dots. A teenager with dyed blue hair squinted at the man, then gasped. "Wait a second. Is that Elon Musk?" she said, pulling out her phone to snap a picture. Her words spread quickly among the small crowd, drawing more onlookers. Karen, oblivious to the whispers, folded her arms smugly, her eyes fixed on the man as if she had already won some imaginary battle. The faint sound of sirens in the distance grew louder, signaling the arrival of the police. A sense of tension settled over the park, and even those who had dismissed Karen's antics began paying attention. The man finally glanced up, his gaze drifting toward the source of the noise. His expression didn't change, calm, curious, as if he were watching a minor distraction rather than the makings of a spectacle. He closed his book gently and placed it beside him on the bench, his movements deliberate and unhurried. Karen smirked, certain her efforts were about to be validated. But as the sirens grew louder, so did the whispers among the crowd. "That's definitely him," someone said. "Elon Musk here? No way." The park's tranquil atmosphere had transformed into a stage, and everyone was watching, waiting for the first act to begin. The police cruiser rolled to a stop near the park's entrance, its flashing lights slicing through the serene scene. Two officers stepped out, scanning the crowd that had now gathered loosely around the bench. Their strides were deliberate as they approached, their hands resting on their utility belts. Karen's smugness intensified. She waved them over, eager to explain her concerns. "Officers," she called out, pointing directly at Elon Musk. "That man over there? He's been acting suspiciously. He's making people uncomfortable." The officers exchanged a glance but didn't immediately rush into action, They walked toward Karen, who launched into a detailed, if not exaggerated, account of her perceived grievances. "He's sitting there with that hat, looking like he's up to no good. I don't know what he's planning, but it's definitely not right." The younger officer, a Latino man in his early 30s, tilted his head slightly. "So, he's sitting on a bench, reading a book?" Karen's face flushed with frustration. "It's not just that. Look at the hat. It's provocative. It's causing a disturbance." Meanwhile, Elon remained seated, his hands resting lightly on his knees. His eyes followed the exchange from a distance, his face unreadable. The crowd surrounding him had grown. A few people murmured, some filming discreetly, others openly whispering about the absurdity of the situation. The second officer, an older woman with a no-nonsense demeanor, stepped forward. Her sharp gaze scanned the scene before settling on Elon. She took a moment to assess him, calm, composed, his posture giving no indication of aggression or intent to disrupt. She exhaled, clearly unimpressed with the escalating theatrics. The officers approached Elon cautiously, their expressions neutral but professional. Karen followed closely behind, practically bursting with self-righteous glee. As they reached him, Elon looked up, his demeanor so composed it disarmed even the skeptical. "Good afternoon," the younger officer said, his tone polite but firm. "We received a call about a disturbance. May we see some ID?" Elon didn't flinch. He nodded slightly, reached into his pocket and pulled out his wallet. The small movement sent a ripple of murmurs through the crowd. "Is he really going to show them?" someone whispered. Elon handed his ID to the officer, who inspected it briefly before his eyebrows shot up. Recognition flickered across his face. He turned to his partner, subtly showing her the name on the card. Her reaction was equally surprised, though she maintained her professionalism. "Wait, you're—" the younger officer started, but Elon cut him off with a small, knowing smile. "Yes," he said, his voice steady and unbothered. "I'm Elon Musk." Karen froze, her smug expression evaporating in an instant. Her eyes darted between the officers and Elon, disbelief etched across her face. "Elon Musk?" she stammered, as if the name itself was foreign to her. The older officer sighed, clearly unimpressed by the situation. She turned to Karen, her voice tinged with mild irritation. "Ma'am, you called us because a man was sitting quietly, reading a book and wearing a hat?" Karen's confidence wavered, but she tried to defend herself. "I didn't know who he was. The hat, it's offensive. It's disruptive." The younger officer shook his head, handing Elon's ID back with an apologetic nod. "Sir, we're sorry to bother you. Clearly there's no issue here." Elon took his ID and slipped it back into his wallet. His gaze shifted to Karen, his expression still calm but now edged with subtle disapproval. He didn't raise his voice, didn't move aggressively. Instead, he asked one simple question. "Did you judge me by the hat or the person wearing it?" The crowd fell silent, the weight of the question hanging in the air. Karen stumbled over her words, trying to form a coherent response. I just thought," she started, but her voice faltered. The crowd wasn't on her side anymore, and she could feel it. "She called the cops on Elon Musk over a hat?" someone muttered, loud enough for others to hear. Laughter rippled through the group, small at first, but growing louder. Karen's face turned crimson as she realized she was the object of ridicule. Elon didn't press further. He simply leaned back slightly, his body language signaling that he had already moved on from the incident. But Karen's ordeal was just beginning. Phones were out, recording the scene from every angle. The onlookers' whispers grew louder, many now openly mocking her. "Guess she didn't think this one through," someone chuckled. The officers exchanged another glance, this time with visible irritation. The older one addressed Karen directly. "Ma'am, this doesn't appear to be a law enforcement issue. Please consider the consequences of making unnecessary calls in the future." Karen opened her mouth to argue, but no words came out. She stood there, frozen, as the officers walked away, shaking their heads. Karen's confidence had evaporated, leaving her rooted in place as the murmurs and laughter of the growing crowd washed over her. She turned her head, scanning the faces now focused squarely on her. Every whisper, every chuckle, felt like a dagger of humiliation. "That's Elon Musk, for crying out loud," someone said, loud enough for everyone to hear. "And she called the cops on him for wearing a hat?" A teenager with a skateboard laughed, pointing his phone at Karen. "This is going viral for sure," he said, already typing furiously into his device. Others in the crowd followed suit, capturing every second of the unfolding drama. Elon, still seated on the bench, didn't appear fazed. He leaned down, calmly picking up his book as if the last 10 minutes hadn't happened. A woman with a baby stroller approached him, her curiosity getting the better of her. "Mr. Musk," she said softly, "I'm sorry you had to go through this. Some people just don't think before they act." Elon glanced up, offering her a polite smile. "It's all right," he said, his tone gentle but firm. "What matters is what we learn from it." Karen, now the center of attention for all the wrong reasons, began backing away, her face flushed and her eyes darting from one recording phone to the next. "I didn't mean," she started, but her words were cut off by someone in the crowd. "You didn't mean what? To embarrass yourself or to judge someone for no reason?" the voice called out, dripping with sarcasm. Laughter erupted again, and Karen's retreat quickened. Meanwhile, Elon rose to his feet, slipping his book under his arm. The crowd quieted almost immediately, the weight of his presence commanding their attention. He turned to face them, his expression serene but purposeful. "It's easy to judge," he said, his voice carrying effortlessly. "A hat, a piece of clothing, a symbol. It's easy to make assumptions based on what we see, but what we often forget is the person behind it." His words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. The crowd, captivated by his calm yet authoritative tone, leaned in as if trying to absorb every syllable. "I wore this hat today not to make a statement, but to see how people would react, to see if we've grown past the stage where a piece of fabric can cause this much division." He paused, scanning the faces before him. "Clearly, we still have work to do." Karen froze mid-step, her back still turned to the crowd. She wanted to run, to disappear, but Elon's words seemed to root her in place. She turned slightly, just enough to catch his gaze, and for a moment her face softened. Whether it was shame, regret, or a mix of both, it was impossible to tell. Elon continued, his voice unwavering. "We all carry biases, myself included, but the real question is, are we willing to confront them, to question them, or are we going to let them dictate how we treat others?" The silence in the park was deafening. Even the birds seemed to stop chirping, as if nature itself was holding its breath. Karen's shoulders slumped, her earlier bravado reduced to a shadow of itself. "I hope," Elon said, his gaze now fixed on Karen, "that this moment serves as a reminder to all of us. Look deeper. Ask questions. Don't let appearances be the only thing that shapes your judgment." The crowd erupted into applause, the sound filling the park with an energy that seemed to cleanse the air. Karen took one last look at the scene, her face etched with humiliation, and hurried out of the park, her heels clicking against the pavement in an uneven rhythm. As the applause died down, Elon returned to his bench, reopening his book. For a moment no one moved, as if afraid to disrupt the calm that had returned. Then, slowly, the crowd began to disperse, their conversations buzzing with the weight of what they had witnessed. A teenager approached Elon, nervously holding out a phone. "Mr. Musk," he said, "that was really cool. Can I, get a picture?" Elon smiled faintly. "Only if you promise to read this book someday," he said, holding it up. The teen nodded enthusiastically, snapping a quick selfie before scurrying off. The park, once tense with conflict, now buzzed with a different kind of energy, one of reflection and quiet admiration. Karen's hurried footsteps echoed faintly as she left the park, her head lowered and her expression a mix of embarrassment and shame. She clutched her phone tightly, as if it could shield her from the eyes of those who had witnessed her downfall. Every chuckle, every pointed whisper from the crowd still rang in her ears, and the weight of Elon's words pressed heavily on her chest. As she disappeared beyond the tree line, the mood in the park shifted. The onlookers, once fueled by outrage and ridicule, now stood in thoughtful silence. Conversations slowly sparked among small groups, their voices carrying a mix of empathy, curiosity, and self-reflection. "You know," an older man with a Boston Red Sox cap said to his wife, "I've probably done the same thing, judged someone too quickly without knowing a thing about them." His wife nodded, her expression somber. "We all do it, don't we? But seeing it play out like that makes you think." Not far away, a young woman with a baby stroller spoke with a group of joggers who had paused their run to watch the commotion. "I mean, I don't even like that hat," she said, gesturing toward Elon's MAGA cap. But calling the cops on someone just for wearing it? That's insane. One of the joggers shrugged. It's not just about the hat, though. People are so quick to react these days. Everyone's on edge, and no one stops to think anymore. The conversation swirled around Elon, who remained seated on the bench, flipping a page in his book as if the world hadn't just erupted around him. But his presence was magnetic. People gravitated toward him, not to disturb, but to share in the quiet wisdom he seemed to radiate. A boy, no older than 10, hesitantly approached Elon, clutching a small notebook. His parents stood a few feet away, smiling nervously. Elon noticed the boy and looked up, offering a warm, encouraging nod. "Mr. Musk," the boy began, his voice trembling slightly, "why did you wear the hat if you knew people might get mad?" Elon's gaze softened. He closed his book again and gestured for the boy to sit beside him. "What's your name?" Elon asked. "Dylan," the boy replied, his small hands gripping the notebook tightly. "Well, Dylan," Elon began, "sometimes it's important to do things that make people think. The hat doesn't define me, just like it doesn't define anyone else who wears it. But it has a way of making people show their true colors. And sometimes seeing those colors is the first step to changing them." The boy nodded, his brow furrowed in thought. "So, you wanted people to learn something?" Elon smiled faintly. "Exactly. And sometimes learning isn't comfortable, but it's always worth it." The boy's parents watched with pride as Dylan scribbled something in his notebook. "Thank you, Mr. Musk," he said earnestly before rejoining his parents. As the boy walked away, an older woman approached Elon, her face etched with wrinkles that spoke of a life well lived. "I just wanted to say thank you," she said, her voice steady, "for handling that the way you did. You didn't yell, you didn't fight, you just made us all think." Elon inclined his head slightly. "Sometimes the loudest message is the one spoken softly." Her eyes glistened as she nodded and walked away, leaving Elon to his book once more. The park, once a stage for confrontation, now felt like a classroom, its attendees leaving with something they hadn't expected, a lesson in empathy and perspective. The sun dipped lower in the sky, painting the park in hues of gold and amber. The tension from earlier had dissolved, replaced by a reflective calm that settled over the remaining crowd. Those who had stayed lingered not out of curiosity, but out of an unspoken need to process what they had just witnessed. Conversations grew softer, and the park began to return to its peaceful rhythm. Elon remained seated on the bench, his book open once more. But this time, he wasn't reading. He looked out at the park, his expression pensive. A young woman, holding a camera and wearing a San Francisco Giants cap, hesitated before stepping forward. "Mr. Musk," she began, her voice tentative, I just wanted to say that what you said earlier really hit me. You're right. We're so quick to judge, and I've done it more times than I care to admit." Elon turned to her, offering a small, understanding smile. "Acknowledging it is the first step," he said simply. "None of us are perfect, but we all have the capacity to do better." She nodded, her eyes glistening. "Do you think the woman who called the police, will learn from this?" Elon paused, considering her question. "I hope so," he said at last. "We can't control how others grow, but we can plant the seed. Whether or not it takes root, that's up to her." The woman nodded again, her shoulders relaxing, as if his words had lifted a weight she hadn't realized she was carrying. "Thank you," she said, before walking away, her camera dangling at her side. As the evening settled in, Elon rose from the bench, tucking his book under his arm. A few of the park's visitors, still scattered around, waved or called out quiet words of gratitude. Elon acknowledged them with a nod or a wave, but kept moving, his strides purposeful, yet unhurried. By the time Elon reached the park's entrance, the crowd had mostly dispersed. Only a few people remained, their conversations tinged with the weight of the day's events. Nearby, a small group of teenagers huddled around their phones, the glow of their screens lighting their faces as they watched the video that was already circulating online. The footage had captured everything. Karen's dramatic 911 call, the police interaction, Elon's calm rebuttal, and the crowd's shift from confusion to admiration. In less than an hour, it had started to trend, sparking conversations across social media platforms. Elon Musk confronts Karen over MAGA hat. One headline read, "Grace under fire. Elon Musk's unexpected lesson in a public park," said another. But as the online world dissected the incident, those who had been there carried a different kind of story home with them, a personal one. It wasn't just about Elon or Karen or the hat. It was about their own biases, their own quick judgments, and the quiet realization that they, too, had lessons to learn. The next day, the incident was the talk of the nation. Debates raged online and on talk shows, with some praising Elon's composure and others criticizing Karen's actions. But amid the noise, one thing stood out, a message that resonated beyond the spectacle. In an interview a week later, Elon addressed the incident for the first time. Sitting calmly in front of a journalist, he reiterated the words he had spoken in the park. Assumptions are easy. Understanding is harder. But if we want to move forward as a society, we need to challenge ourselves to choose the harder path. And just like in the park, his words planted seeds. Whether they would grow depended on the listeners.